Thank you. And thank you for having me here today. This is really exciting. It's exciting to be here. Thank you all for coming. So exponential creativity in a world of abundance. That's what we're going to talk about. So first, I have a confession to make, which is that I'm an optimist. It's kind of a relief to say that out loud, to be honest. Optimism, I realize, is it's very much out of favor these days, right? Because, well, if you look around, it sort of seems like everything's kind of going straight to hell. Now, don't get me wrong. There are plenty of legitimate reasons to be terrified. Climate change, war. This is happening right now in Aleppo. Whatever this is. And yet, I'm here to tell you that despite all of that, the proverbial glass really is half full. Because when you pull back far enough from the page, you realize that we're actually doing pretty well as a species. We're doing well in the fundamental stuff, like curing disease and eradicating poverty. And we're also doing remarkably well in the more aspirational stuff. And that includes all different forms of creativity and expression, which I would argue is when humans are at their absolute best. So before I can show you exactly what I mean, we're going to take a brief detour, I promise it'll be brief detour, into a math/history lesson. Because the foundation of my optimism is my confidence in the power of exponential technologies. Okay, so people throw around the term exponential growth, right? When what they really just mean is really fast growth. But exponential growth has a specific mathematical meaning, and that's the one we're talking about when we talk about exponential technologies. So what's an exponential technology? Well, how many of you have heard of Moore's law? Hopefully some. Okay, some. All right, good. So Gordon Moore, the founder of Intel, he famously observed that the number of transistors that could be put on a silicon chip seemed to double roughly every 18 to 24 months like clockwork, year after year after year. And of course, this is the basic phenomenon that has driven the explosion in computing power over the last 50 years. But here's where it gets interesting. Then a guy named Ray Kurzweil came along, and he decided to abstract Moore's law to be about computing power per dollar, right, rather than in silicon chips specifically. And he managed to track it back to actually way before the invention of the computer. Remarkably, this exponential growth rate holds, this curve holds, as you can see from the log chart here. What's even more amazing, though, is that this same basic phenomenon, it applies to basically all information technologies. So that includes like network bandwidth. You can track network bandwidth back from like smoke signals, a single bit every few seconds, up to modern fiber optics. It follows this same log curve, right? Computer storage density, digital biology, and then my personal favorite, solar power collection. So what's interesting about solar power, and what a lot of people don't understand about solar power, is that it's not actually a fuel source. It's an information technology. The sun currently hits the Earth with 10,000 times as much energy as we consume from all energy sources put together. 10,000 times. So the limiting factor there is not the amount of sun energy that there is, right? The limiting factor is our ability to capture it, to store it, to process it. And that's a technology, and that's an exponential technology. And that's why we're seeing, unlike any other energy source, we're seeing solar power follow one of these very powerful exponential growth curves. So let's look at this in practice. Let's take a look at computing power, okay? Specifically, let's consider how much of it you can get per second for $1,000. So around the turn of the century, a $1,000 computer had about the same raw processing power as a single insect brain. There's a lot of neurons, even in an insect brain, right? Today, we're roughly on par with the brain of a mouse. Okay, making progress. But we're actually just a few years off from parity with the human brain. And then, if you project out to around 2045, you have single computers, $1,000 computers, each with the same processing power as all 7 billion human brains put together. Right, so this may sound hard to believe intuitively, and if you're a skeptic, you're in good company. Every few years, some expert comes out and publishes a scholarly paper predicting the imminent end of Moore's law. We've finally run into the fundamental limits of the laws of physics, that's what they say. In 2007, none other than Gordon Moore himself declared that this phenomenon, it's had a nice run, it's going to run its course, though, probably 2017 is when it's done. Okay, then in 2015, he came out and he revised his prediction to say that it's actually going to end in 2025. Okay, so every time it seems as though we're about to hit some fundamental limitation, right, we manage to break through the immovable wall, whether it's new manufacturing techniques, parallel processing, quantum computing, which is kind of the new frontier, or what's likely the frontier after that, biological interfaces. You can store a lot of computing power in a strand of DNA. The truth is, for these growth trajectories to hold, right, they've just got to keep doing what they've been doing for 10,000 years. My money's on that trend continuing. Oops. Okay, so I don't know if I accidentally moved forward too many slides, but so here's another lens on the same phenomenon. This is an illustration of Buckminster Fuller's knowledge doubling curve, which was a concept from his book Critical Path, which was published in 1981. So Fuller observed that up until around 1900, humanity's collective knowledge, everything we know collectively as a species, was doubling approximately every century. Well, what he observed was by the end of World War II, human knowledge was doubling every 25 years. Today, on average, human knowledge is doubling around every 13 months. So how far can we take this? Well, a recent projection from IBM declared that the build-out of the Internet of Things will lead to the doubling of our collective knowledge every 12 hours. Of course, it doesn't stop there. It just keeps going. Okay, so what does it look like when the power of exponents is harnessed by humanity in the name of progress? It looks like a transition from scarcity, the dominant economic paradigm since the dawn of life on planet Earth, to abundance. And in fact, the world is in much better shape than you likely realize. Let me share some examples. So this chart shows the percentage of the global population living in extreme poverty, which means around $2 a day or less. In 1820, about 95% of the world lived in abject poverty. 160 years later, in 1980, it had declined to about 50%. Today, it's less than 10%, and it's growing smaller all the time. If you look at that curve, that's kind of what an exponential curve looks like. How many of you are worried about overpopulation? It's a popular thing to be worried about. Well, one of the things that happens when people rise out of extreme poverty is that they start having fewer children. As a result, reproductive rates are rapidly declining worldwide. More importantly, we're quickly approaching a sustainable zero population growth rate. It should be there by the end of this century. This chart shows global death rates from things like floods, earthquakes, and droughts over the past 120 years. By historical standards, as you can see, we have virtually eliminated deaths from natural disasters. Maternal mortality rates have dropped by 50% since 1990 alone. In the United States and other developed nations, maternal death during childbirth has been nearly eradicated. Now, you may have heard some recent statistics. There has been an uptick in maternal mortality rates in the United States, and that is actually happening. But again, in the long arc of history, which is what we're looking at here, we're still on a compelling and sustained downward trend. How about infant mortality? Here too, as you can see, the numbers have hugely improved and are getting better every day. And in contrast to what you may have heard, what the data tells us is that as societies get richer, people work less because technology does more and more things that you used to need humans to do. This chart shows the decline in the number of hours that people are working each year in a number of rich countries since World War II. Now, you can ask yourself why hours in the US have declined so much less than in other Western European nations, but even here, there's been a meaningful drop. Right? So culture still actually matters. Okay. So why is this so counterintuitive? Why are there still so many skeptical faces out there? Why does it seem like everything's getting worse? So I blame this guy, right? Our brains evolved over millions of years to prioritize threats over opportunities. If you're an early human wandering the Serengeti, you're looking out for two things. Number one, food. Number two, predators for whom you're the food. Okay? If you fail to spot that bush over there with the tasty berries on it, well, that's a bummer. You'll probably go to bed hungry. If you fail to spot that lion in the tall grass, well, guess whose DNA is not going to live on in future generations? So these days, the landscape is reversed. Right? For most of us, there are no lions in the grass. But there are opportunities all around us that we're missing because we're distracted by the problems that we do still face. Our brains are still adapted to a hunter-gatherer existence because that's when the evolutionary pressure was strongest. Right? And by comparison, 10,000 years of civilization are barely a blip on the radar. It means we're hardwired to focus on the bad news, and we tend to discount or gloss over the good things. They're just less memorable. So is this what I'm advocating? Do we just decide to ignore the bad and embrace the good by sheer force of positive thinking? Of course not, because there's still actually a lot of work to be done. And also, this is a really profoundly terrible song that I would not advocate anybody ever listen to. Okay, so you remember this slide with the drop in the infant mortality rates? So even as the rate has dropped dramatically for both white and African American babies, there remains a huge divide, relatively speaking, between those two populations. And of course, this is far from the only area in which the benefits of progress have been unevenly distributed. So abundance isn't really abundance unless everyone gets to participate. It's one of the biggest challenges we face, and so far, to be perfectly honest, we're not doing a great job. Speaking of jobs, hopefully some of you get the South Park reference. I realize it's a little dated at this point, but here I'm actually not talking about cheap labor from the future. I'm talking about technology and especially artificial intelligence and robotics. So many jobs that currently require humans, I'm sure you all know this, many jobs that currently require humans will soon be done by robots or AIs, artificial intelligence. It's not just the jobs you think. So according to the World Economic Forum, a net 5 million jobs will be lost worldwide by 2020 as a result of developments in genetics, artificial intelligence, and robotics. Admin and office jobs are going to account for 2/3 of those losses. In the long term, a 2013 Oxford University study looked at the probability of computerization for 702 detailed occupations. You know what they found? They determined that 47% of US jobs are under threat to be replaced by automation. Now, lest you think that you're immune because everybody here is highly educated, it's worth pointing out that many experts think that human doctors are at a much greater risk than human nurses. Almost everything a doctor does can be handled by an AI or a robot with better accuracy, fewer mistakes, more precision, and at greater scale. With nurses, however, a significant part of the job is about empathy and human connection. It's not impossible to replicate, but it's a lot tougher, probably a lot further off. So what can we do about this? So how often do you find out that Bernie Sanders and Richard Nixon agreed on something? Well, it turns out, actually, that this trend toward greater and greater automation fits into a larger political discussion that's been going on since the 1960s, and it's perhaps the only economic policy issue that has substantial support from both the radical left, radical progressives, and hardcore libertarians. We're talking about universal basic income. So this is the idea that we get rid of all means-tested entitlement programs and replace them with a single program that guarantees every citizen a basic subsistence level income, no questions asked. Now, advocates on the left see this as a move toward social justice. Its libertarian supporters, which included Milton Friedman, the greatest libertarian of all time, see it as kind of the least damaging way for the government to transfer wealth from some citizens to others and to replace inefficient, market-distorting entitlement programs. Now, I point this out because we're going to start hearing a lot more about universal basic income, UBI, and that's likely to increase in the coming decade. In fact, there are actually a handful of experimental studies, programs that are happening in the US and around the world as we speak. Results are not yet conclusive. They've shown a few different things, but they're promising, actually. Regardless, the truth is, it doesn't have to be this specifically. The truth is, if we don't adopt something like this, something along this line, something that takes a radical approach to addressing income and asset inequality, the social unrest in the 21st century is going to be like nothing we've ever seen before. 4.9% unemployment got Donald Trump elected. What's going to happen when we get to 47%? Right? That's not a rhetorical question. As you may remember from a couple slides ago, that's the actual percentage that we're looking at. That's the actual percentage of current US jobs that are likely to be automated in the next 20 years. So this is a problem that's got to be solved, and UBI is one way to do it. But like I said, I'm an optimist, so for the moment, let's wave our hands. We're assuming we're going to pull it together. We're going to adopt something like universal basic income before everything falls apart. Now, you remember this chart about the steadily declining work hours? Now, imagine a world with universal basic income and either widespread unemployment or dramatically reduced work weeks. It's got to be one or the other. Either way, we're going to have a lot more time on our hands. Now, what do we know about how people prioritize their time and their energy once basic needs are taken care of? Well, one framework for thinking about this is Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm sure many of you have seen this pyramid before. Basic idea is that you can only focus on higher level needs once the lower levels of the pyramid are taken care of. So, you don't care if you're hungry if you can't breathe. You don't care if you're lonely if you don't have enough to eat. You don't care about your job title unless you already have strong social ties, etc. So this concept goes all the way up to the top of the pyramid, which Maslow called self-actualization. So self-actualization for Maslow depends on the maximum realization and fulfillment of our potentials, talents, and abilities. Although a person may satisfy all the other needs in the hierarchy, if that person is not self-actualized, he or she will be restless, frustrated, and discontent. So in his writing on self-actualization, Maslow said this: "A musician must make music, an artist must paint, a poet must write, to be ultimately at peace." Those are some interesting examples, don't you think? So in truth, Maslow believed, and subsequent research has reinforced this idea, that creative expression is perhaps the single most powerful contributor to self-actualization. So it's not hard to theorize that as we transition from a world of scarcity to a world of abundance, people will start spending a lot more time making art or involved in some kind of meaningful creative practice. Now, it's really important to clarify here, I'm not just talking about professional artists. I'm not even mainly talking about professional artists. I'm talking about people who may not consider themselves artists or self-identify as that, certainly don't aspire to make a living economically from their art, but for whom some kind of regular creative practice is an important part of their lives, their identities, their sense of meaning and purpose in life. So how would we know if this was actually happening? Abundance is still pretty far off, right? It's probably too early to tell. It's not too early to tell. This is happening all over the place. Okay, not one of these people is a professional costume designer. And yet cosplayers spend countless hours and thousands of dollars lovingly crafting the perfect costumes. These aren't corporate R&D labs. They're maker spaces and maker fairs. How much of this would be possible without some of those exponential technologies we were talking about before? You used to need a Fortune 100 R&D budget to do this kind of stuff, and now it's, a $100 monthly membership. None of these middle-class American women will ever have a solo gallery show, but you know what? They don't care. These are paint and sip clubs. They're cropping up all over suburbia. They gleefully explore amateur painting in a no-judgment setting, complete with bottomless glasses of wine. One just opened up in my neighborhood, actually. So how many of these works of public art were commissioned by major municipalities? The answer, of course, is none. These were all done for Burning Man. And these artists all have full-time day jobs in corporate America. No amount of practice is going to get these folks to Carnegie Hall. But that's really not the point. They're all part of a huge upsurge in participation in community choruses and theaters. In the early 2000s, the role-playing and tabletop gaming industries were at the brink of death. It has now experienced a decade plus of double-digit revenue growth. Players collaborate to create original stories, with many choosing to sculpt, paint, craft supplemental materials. Exponential technologies play a role here, too. There's an online platform called Roll20, where you can play Dungeons and Dragons with people all over the world using a virtual tabletop. There's a site called Hero Forge, where you can go and use a simple online interface to do a 3D model of your character for your role-playing game, complete with whatever weapons and armor and whatever you've got. And then you can get a 3D printed copy of it in the mail a week later. There's no Pulitzer Prize for fan fiction, but there are rabid online communities dedicated to expanding the fictional worlds they love through online stories. Sorry, through original stories. Okay, anybody ever heard the acronym AFOL? Anybody? Looks like one hand, maybe. So AFOL stands for Adult Fan of Lego. So, for real, this is one of the driving factors behind the rebirth and explosive growth of a 100-year-old Danish toy company. Lego, another one. They were almost bankrupt in 2003, and now I think they're the second largest toy company in the world, and they have one product, basically. It's pretty amazing. My favorite aspect of this dedicated community is the birth of the brick film as a genre. This is a real thing that lots of people do. These are short films made using stop-motion animation and Lego figures. Let's think about exponential technologies again. How would you have made a brick film in 1992? You couldn't. It would have been impossible, right? Before widespread digital cameras, before 99-cent professional-grade film editing applications, it was an impossibility. Now they're all over the place. And of course, there's YouTube, where it seems just about anyone can attract millions of subscribers to their homemade videos. The role of exponential tech here is more or less self-explanatory. Yeah, so then there's this. Just going to leave this here for a minute. Okay, so the casual creativity wave is clearly happening. It seems to be accelerating. But we haven't asked yet whether this is a good or a bad thing. No doubt there are many brilliant artists who've spent a lifetime honing their craft who would weep at the idea of a world dominated by amateurs and hobbyists. So we have to ask the really tough question. Why does art matter in the first place? There's so much hand-wringing in the arts community about this, about our impact. Right? How do we define it? How do we measure it? How do we document it? And the dirty secret that no one wants to admit is that it's really hard to prove that we have much positive impact at all when it comes to art consumption. Nobody takes the economic impact studies seriously. I'm sorry, they don't. And the research on intrinsic impact has been inconclusive at best. Strongest evidence, probably for the benefits to the tourism industry, but it's about as far as I'm willing to claim with confidence. Okay, but I'm going to tell you why art matters. So how many of you remember this scene from the movie Titanic? Yes. Okay, it's not the greatest movie, but this one scene always makes me cry. And to be totally honest, I actually teared up a little bit when I was making this slide. I'm like a little bit afraid I'm going to start crying now, which would be incredibly embarrassing, so I'm going to try to keep it together. Okay, so in this scene, this great scene, it's becoming clear that the ship is going down and that a lot of people are going to die. And the string quartet is on the deck doing its job, which is to play music for the rich passengers so as to maintain a veneer of civility amid the mounting chaos. Well, at some point, they decide their job is done. They stop playing. They start to go their separate ways. But the violinist stays behind, and he starts playing Nearer, My God, to Thee. There's this beautiful moment where the other musicians all stop walking away, they turn around, and they join him in the song. They've all silently decided in that moment that they're going to go down making music. Not because it's their job, certainly not for any audience, but purely for love, and because it brings them peace in extremis. There's a ton of research that demonstrates what those string players knew, which is that there are powerful positive benefits of making art. For arts professionals, this is potentially uncomfortable territory. But however much it makes us squirm, if we consider the well-being of humanity as a whole, a dramatic increase in casual creativity is about the best thing that could possibly happen. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. I have to say, I used this image for tip of the iceberg because I figured after the Titanic thing it would be like insensitive to do an actual iceberg. So we're going to do this one instead. So we're in the very earliest stages in this shift from scarcity to abundance. And most people, even in rich countries like the United States, aren't feeling it yet. That means that there's a lot of untapped potential yet to be unleashed. Now, a significant part of that potential lies in finishing the job of connecting the world through the internet. That's happening as we speak. In 2010, there were about 1.5 billion people globally connected to the internet. By 2020, that's projected to be over 5 billion. That's more than 3 billion new minds, new voices, new stories, plugged into this amazing, terrifying web of exponential technologies that we've built. And as those technologies continue to improve, and we continue making progress on some of those fundamental challenges that we've faced since the dawn of humanity, we're going to continue our climb up Maslow's hierarchy of needs toward, I believe, ubiquitous creative expression in the interest of self-actualization. Okay, so put it all together. What do you get? Exponential technologies are democratizing the systems of artistic production, financing, distribution, and consumption. This is unleashing explosive growth in the number of non-professional artists with meaningful creative practice. Growing automation and wealth are unlocking increased time and energy for creativity. And as the phenomenon of abundance expands across the globe, this developed world phenomenon will rapidly take hold in the developing world as well. Okay, so this is the million-dollar question, right? Are we still relevant? What role is there for professional arts institutions in a world with 5 billion amateur artists, where the barriers to entry for artistic production and distribution are nearly non-existent? Look, we can embrace this or we can fight it. Everything I've been talking about so far is not prescriptive, it's a prediction. Just 10 years ago, the financial crisis triggered a rash of bankruptcies and labor conflicts that revealed just how fragile our field has already become. The forces I'm describing are bigger than any of us. We can try to fight them, but I guarantee you will lose. So, for those of us who have dedicated our lives to work in the arts, how do we work with rather than against this sea change? Rules for relevance in a world of abundance. Rule number 1, Arts organizations are social constructs. What do I mean by that? So first off, art is not a social construct. These cave paintings were made 65,000 years ago by Neanderthals in what is now the Basque region of Spain. We don't know exactly where the impulse to create them came from. Some speculate that they're a form of hunting magic, which isn't too different in spirit from some religious art produced to this day. Others believe that it functioned as a kind of historical document. Regardless, whether it's purely expressive or quasi-utilitarian, these primitive artists managed to transcend in some small way the grim constraints of their daily lives. This jewelry is even older. This is estimated to have been made 115,000 years ago. What's more, it seems likely that it served a purely decorative function. Specimens like this have been found that are even older and in totally distinct geographical areas such that the inventions were likely independent of each other. So think about the implications of that. Art has existed for at least twice as long as modern humans have as a species, and for 20 times as long as we've been living in even the most primitive of civilizations. It appears that the impulse to create, to express ideas or emotions, to tell stories, it's something that happens inevitably and universally for species above a certain threshold of intelligence. Notably, that appears to be a lower threshold than is required for inventions like agriculture, government, or any of the other foundations of civilization. Okay, now let's talk about arts organizations. This is Musei Capitolini in Rome. It was created in 1471 by Pope Sixtus IV and was opened to the public in 1734. It's considered the oldest art museum in the world. The oldest orchestra in the world, meanwhile, is generally believed to be the Royal Danish Orchestra, which dates back to 1448. So in other words, we've been making art for at least 130,000 years, but arts organizations have only existed for about 570 years. And in truth, if we're talking about the modern arts organization, an independent professional institution, then we're really talking about a post-World War II invention. So why does this matter? It matters because when you're in the trenches every day, as many of you are, it starts to feel like you're in the arts organization business. And really, you're in the art business. Arts organizations are social constructs that are mostly useful as delivery systems for the work of artists. They serve some other functions as well, but in and of themselves, there's nothing sacred or essential about them. Arts organizations were invented to serve a specific social purpose, namely to facilitate the financing, production, and distribution of art. So this is one of my all-time favorite business quotes. Comes from Theodore Levitt, an economist and author who's most famous for his 1959 book, Marketing Myopia, in which he challenges business leaders to ask what business they're actually in. I am here today to tell you that you are not in the arts organization business. You are in the art business. Organizations are sometimes useful tools that help you conduct that business. But when they cease to be useful, either in general or for some specific purpose, some specific aspect of their historical purpose, right, then the absolute worst thing you can do is retreat into sentimentality about your own quarter-inch drill. Rule number 2. An actively engaged audience is not the enemy. From that first Neanderthal jewelry through the late Middle Ages, art was participatory. And the concept of a professional artist was, frankly, an oxymoron. Cave paintings, fire dances, songs about heroes of old. We did these things not for passion, fame, or fortune, but because they affirmed our humanity. They reinforced communal bonds, propagated tribal identity from one generation to the next. Earlier, we talked about the explosive growth in casual creativity. In many ways, this isn't new. This is actually a return to the way things were for over 100,000 years. It's no wonder, then, that audience expectations have shifted toward active participation rather than passive consumption. I can't stress enough, this is not a fad, and this is not like some silly thing that millennials invented. So why then, if we're hardwired for this, do so many organizations insist on providing this? Good news is that a lot of arts organizations have already figured this out, or at least starting to do so. Consider the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History, which has made visitor participation an essential part of its exhibition philosophy. Or you can think about the growing number of theaters that actively encourage live tweeting of their performances. The scary part, right? Let's be honest, the scary part, and the part that many artists and organizations struggle with, is that you have to be willing to share control of the audience experience and of the messaging that surrounds it. That takes a huge leap of faith, and it's frankly way outside most of our comfort zones. But if you want to be relevant 10 or 20 years from now, then you'd better start thinking of your audience as authentic collaborators and not just consumers. Rule number 3, representation matters. Okay, this is sort of a corollary to the last one, but I decided it was important enough to warrant its own rule. You've all heard about how the United States will soon be a so-called majority-minority nation. This shift is well underway and includes related trends like increased religious diversity and, of course, more households where English is not the primary language. Now, there's justifiably a lot of hand-wringing in the arts community about how we can diversify our audiences. In part, that's because diversity and inclusion are values that most of us hold dear. It's also because we're smart enough to realize that the audience demographics we've traditionally served are on a long, steady decline. Okay, so here's the thing. There are right and wrong ways to go about this. This is the wrong way to do it. This is our vice president celebrating Black History Month by honoring a white man. Now, I'm pretty sure that I respect and appreciate Abraham Lincoln as much or more than Mike Pence does. But there's a time and a place, right? Okay, so as fun as it is to pick on Mike Pence, that's not really the point. The point is that many arts organizations approach diversity and outreach the way Mike Pence approaches Black History Month. What I mean by that is that they believe the lack of diversity in their existing audiences is fundamentally a marketing problem rather than something deeper. They adjust their ad buys, or they give free tickets to high school students from traditionally underserved communities. What they don't do is consider what it would take for those folks to actually want to patronize their work. This is the right way to do it. So until about a year ago, I'm going to guess like 2 years ago, probably nobody in this audience knew who Black Panther was. I didn't. Maybe a couple of people, right? Black Panther was like a 3rd or 4th tier superhero in the Marvel universe. And then Marvel and Disney decided to see what would happen if they handed full creative control over a mega superhero action movie to an almost entirely African-American creative team. The result was $1.4 billion in ticket sales and still counting. Tell stories by and about the communities that you want to serve. Representation matters. This has always been true to some degree, but it's so much more important as we shift from a paradigm of passive consumption to active co-creation. Rule number 4, fail loudly and often. Okay, so whatever its flaws, and there are many, there's no denying that Silicon Valley is absolutely crushing the transition from scarcity to abundance. Now, one of the reasons for that is that Silicon Valley is not only comfortable with failure, but actually embraces it as a necessary part of our individual and collective learning process. So this is an image from FailCon. This is like not a tongue-in-cheek, ironic thing. This is a real conference every year. It describes itself as a conference for startup founders to learn from and prepare for failure so that they can iterate and grow fast. Okay, now, I want you to remember, when tech startups fail, millions, sometimes billions of investor dollars evaporate in the process. Nonetheless, not only do their investors understand and accept that, but they're often more likely to back a founder who has failed repeatedly than a first-time founder with no track record at all. That's because they understand that big rewards only come from taking big risks. No free lunch. So if you're not failing a meaningful amount of the time, then that's pretty good evidence that you're not taking big enough risks. Now, imagine that instead of a Silicon Valley venture capitalist, you're talking to a typical arts program officer at a foundation or a board member at a major cultural institution. Okay, so in my experience, and I did this for 20 years, my experience with very few exceptions, it's simply not acceptable to talk about failure. Don't get me wrong, everybody claims that it is. Doesn't matter, it's not. If you actually want to get the grant, right, you'd better persuade them that your bold and ambitious new project, which is entering totally uncharted artistic territory, total terra incognita, is an absolute 100% slam dunk. But the really ridiculous part about this, of course, is that the cost of failure in our field is incredibly low. If you're a tax-exempt nonprofit, then there's already a guaranteed negative 100% return on a backer's investment. That's the expectation going in. So what do we have to lose? Yet we all behave as though squandering a single donor dollar on a new experiment that doesn't quite work out is an existential threat. In a world where exponential change is the fabric of society, cautious incremental progress just doesn't cut it. Silicon Valley understands this and behaves accordingly. We could stand to learn from their example. Rule number 5, scale strategically. So the other thing that Silicon Valley does really well is that they understand the difference between server farms and artisanal cheese. By that, I mean that they're thoughtful and intentional about scaling the things that scale and not trying to scale the things that don't. Now, as a general rule, and this is an oversimplification, but bear with me, infrastructure scales, creativity doesn't. Okay, so first, let's talk about what doesn't scale, because much of what we do in the arts falls into that category. So, it takes 4 musicians, this is a little bit of a math problem for you. It takes 4 musicians, about 40 minutes, to play Beethoven's String Quartet number 14 from start to finish. If you give those same musicians the best, most technologically advanced equipment in the world, it will still take them about 40 minutes. Aha, but if you assign 16 musicians the same string quartet, they can play it in 10 minutes, right? No. Performing Beethoven's String Quartet number 14 does not scale. Output does not measurably improve in responses to increases in either capital or labor. But let's look at this from another angle. Let's look at distribution. Those same 4 trusty musicians can play String Quartet number 14 in the Weil Recital Hall at Carnegie Hall for an audience of 268 people. Or they can walk down to the Stern Auditorium in the same building and play it for 2,804 people. Or they can record their performance and put it on YouTube, where it can reach an audience of 2 billion people. Distributing Beethoven's String Quartet number 14 does scale. Increased capital and especially improved technology can vastly expand its reach. Okay, so this is kind of obvious, I get it, but how can we make this principle actionable in the field where we work? So first, we can make big investments in scalable infrastructure that benefits the field as a whole. The obvious candidates for such investment are things that are technology related, but we could also look at things like marketing or advocacy campaigns. And we do that to some extent, but not as much as we could. Second, we can be smarter about division of labor across organizations. So if you're a deep-pocketed mega institution, then I would argue you should be developing your capacity for marketing and distribution and figuring out maybe where can you get the creative stuff from somebody else. If you're one of the little guys, though, perhaps you ought to become world-class experts in some highly specific artistic niche, right? And then you can partner with the big guys for the distribution to get your work seen by a large audience. Obviously, these are just general suggestions, right? But the point is, historically, every organization has had to develop its own tech for this stuff, its own systems. We've been reinventing wheels hundreds, thousands of times over. All right, so let's do a 3-slide recap. Exponential technologies are democratizing the systems of artistic production, financing, distribution, and consumption. This is unleashing explosive growth in the number of non-professional artists with meaningful creative practice. Growing automation and wealth are unlocking increased time and energy for creativity. And as the phenomenon of abundance expands across the globe, this developed world phenomenon will rapidly take hold in the developing world as well. This raises the question of our continued relevance. But it's possible, I tell you it's possible, to thrive amid exponential creativity in a world of abundance. Remember, arts organizations are social constructs. The art is what matters. Don't fall into the trap of getting sentimental about your delivery tools. An actively engaged audience is not the enemy. Participation is here to stay, so you'd best embrace your audience as authentic co-collaborators, co-creators. Representation matters. You can't expect to expand and diversify your audience without also changing your leadership and your programming. Fail loudly and often. The field needs to shift its culture to one that is more risk tolerant and accepts the possibility of failure as a necessary step toward big success. Finally, scale strategically. Understand the difference between things that scale and things that don't. Let's invest in field-wide scalable infrastructure while allowing individual organizations to specialize in the things that they do best. And that's it for me. Thank you. I think we have time for questions, right? Do we? Somebody? Tell me. We have time for questions? Yes. Yes, we have time for questions. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. Yes, sir.
Jerry Kalstein, Boeing Opera. Do you have a way for us to download, or could you supply us with copies of the PowerPoint?
Yeah, I believe it's going to be made available through the conference app. I gave it to them for the purpose of giving it to you, so I think that's how you can get it. Yeah. Sure.
You quickly listed a couple examples of changes that small, large organizations could make, or sharing direction. Do you have any examples, or can you share some more ideas about what that looks like?
Yeah, I mean, maybe a little self-serving, but the first example, of course, that comes to mind is what I spent the last 20 years working on, right, which is Fractured Atlas. I don't know how many of you have any experience with Fractured Atlas, but that whole business model was about figuring out how to scale the stuff that scales and make that available as a sort of subscription service to small organizations and individual artists, and that includes things like fundraising and tax compliance and legal infrastructure and software for ticketing and CRM and insurance and all of the back office stuff that benefits from having capable, experienced, dedicated staff rather than 4% of a managing director's attention. So that's one model, right? That's a sort of service organization model. I haven't seen a whole lot of, and I'm sure they exist, but I haven't seen a lot of great examples of actual art institutions, like the Lincoln Centers of the world deciding to rent out or share their infrastructure in a way that benefits the field as a whole. I think we're still very parochial about this stuff and proprietary, and that's got to change. It really has to change.
How about museums putting their collections online?
Yeah, I think that's a good example. I mean, I think that's it's a little bit different, right? What that is that's definitely recognizing what scales, right? Which is a form of distribution for that work and allowing them to reach a larger audience. What would be interesting, to Justin's question, would be a museum, building that capability and then making it available to collections at smaller museums and things like that, right? Because it costs a lot to build that stuff in the first place. Actually, I think Google has built some of that basic tech and is making it available for museums at a relatively affordable price point. But. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble seeing the hands. Yes, sir.
Question. Humans are built to tend to put order to things. that's not necessarily there. Sometimes we order the universe on our preconceived notion of what makes sense to us. So the observation that you said that knowledge doubles every 12 hours, or whatever
Sure.
statistic. I was wondering if you can comment on the difference between information doubling
Yeah.
every 12 hours and knowledge doubling.
It's a great question, and it's one that I cringe a little. I mean, it's called the knowledge doubling curve. So that's Buckminster Fuller's language. I fully concede that we're not talking about like wisdom doubling every 12 hours, right? You know, we're talking about information, really. Now, I think one of the real challenges that we face right now is getting better at making sense of all that data, right? The signal-to-noise ratio is a little bit out of whack. I mean, there's big data. Everybody's working on big data. And we've got data scientists trying to, but there's a lot of noise, and I think we need to get better at extracting the signal.
I mean, you heard the laugh in the room when you mentioned about wisdom doubling. I think people know that the more we know isn't necessarily the case of us becoming wiser in using this information. So I think that's an important factor.
Absolutely, and that's it's frankly like an opportunity, and it's also a really very serious threat, because I mean, who does know how to make sense of all that data are the AIs that we're building. Right? And they're getting better and better at it all the time on an exponential curve. So we've got to get better at figuring out how to use their ability to extract actionable insights and actual wisdom, for lack of a better word, from all of that massive, massive data, or else we're going to get left behind. Yes?
Why are you so confident that financial parity is going to happen and we're not going to go back to that thing where 15% of people have the money and the rest of us are not?
I'm not so confident.
Okay.
I would say I'm cautiously optimistic, mostly because we don't have any other choice. Like if we don't do that, if we don't figure that out, we might be extinct within a century. Seriously. So I don't. I mean, that would be like a whole other talk. Is like, how do we convince people that they have to take income inequality seriously? Frankly, not because it slows economic growth or any of these other, there's nothing inherently sort of wrong with unequal distribution of income and wealth from a kind of economist perspective. Maybe something wrong with it from a moral perspective, but even if you're just purely utilitarian, it causes social unrest. I mean, people get angry, right? Even if they're sort of, you hear things like, well, your average lower middle class American is 10 times as rich as a medieval king. And in some ways that's true, right? They have access to nutrition and other information and other things but that doesn't matter, right? We gauge our stature in life relative to our neighbors, right? I think it was H.L. Mencken who said a rich man is somebody who has more money than his brother-in-law, right? I mean, so that's how we think of this stuff. So inequality matters a lot. And I don't think I guess to the extent that I'm optimistic, that I'm cautiously optimistic, it's because there is such a weird mix of advocates, again, from the far left to the far right. And I can't think of anything else that has common ground right now in such a polarized political climate. So maybe there's some hope in that.
I read recently that more people now who visit the Louvre in Paris view the Mona Lisa more through their smartphones than they actually look at the painting.
Yeah.
But my question for you is, what role do you see for virtual reality and augmented reality and the live arts, and even with museums, bringing it to more people?
Yeah, great. I see a lot of potential. I actually wrote an article a few years ago titled "Can Oculus Cure Baumol?" Talking about Baumel's cost disease, which some of you may know. We don't need to get into all that, but basically talking about some of the challenges structurally and economically that arts organizations face in distribution, right, of their work, and the idea that maybe there's an opportunity to use virtual reality to kind of broadcast a live performing arts experience in a way that is nearly indistinguishable from actually being there. And also maybe doing, while you're at it, what's it like if you're watching it from on the stage, right? You can do that in a way that you can't do it with it. So I know some people are working on that. I think it's interesting. It's like 50-50 whether it really takes hold. I mean, when new media are invented, which doesn't happen very often, wholly new media are invented, the first use cases, people think incrementally based on what already exists. They say, okay, so how can I use this new thing to fix my theater problem? Rather than, how do I, as an artist, do things with this medium that I can't do in any other medium? And I think, so those two conversations are sort of happening in parallel, and I think long term, I tend to be a little bit more interested in what some of the artists are doing who are embracing this as just a wholly new medium and trying to figure out what's the kind of aesthetic lexicon of immersive aesthetic experiences. But I do think there's some opportunities.
I want to go back to your comment about risk.
Yeah.
And so in a small organization, the margin for error is extremely tiny. So
Yep.
there is a giant risk in failure. So if you would give advice to a small organization, what participation can we have in changing the culture around failure?
Yeah. Well, there's a risk to the organization. There's a risk to that quarter-inch drill. I mean, I don't mean to be flip or dismissive, because like I've been there. It's stressful, and you got to make the payroll and stuff. Like I know I don't want to dismiss that very real stress, but looking at it from a bigger perspective, yes, taking risk can jeopardize the continued existence of an organization. I think we need to find ways of being okay with that, and that's not just on you, right? That's on our funders, that's on our policymakers, that's on, this is an ecosystem, and we've all got there needs to be a cultural shift around this stuff. I don't think there's some financial trick that you can use in taking risk to make it not as threatening. I mean, risk is risk.
I just want to make a comment about the virtual reality.
Sure.
There was an article recently in the New York Times about how several museums in Europe, well-established, long-standing museums, are actually leveraging virtual reality to bring their exhibits to life for a younger audience, and they're finding that the older audience, people in the demographic from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, are actually much more engaged in the technology and they're surprised actually about this. Now, how that would trickle down to organizations like, say, ours that don't have any money, who can't invest in some sort of virtual reality, the integration, I'm not sure how that would happen, but it is interesting to see. It can die off eventually,
Right.
but it is interesting that these institutions are actually leveraging.
Well, the good news is that maybe you can't afford it now, but you'll be able to afford it soon. I mean, that's the beauty of these exponential curves. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that, what about a small organization like ours that could never possibly afford a computer, much less have a room to put it in, right? I mean, now you got a supercomputer in your pocket. So you'll get there.
There are some interesting trends in, you talk about the arts organizations as social constructs. We tend to think of them as places where people gather to do that work. The millennials are becoming the generation that work remotely. So there might be interesting ways to look at the small organization social construct and examine how it's going to change while you still do what you want to do. How do we fit within a community? Do we give up the expenses of maintaining a space,
Right.
unless we're really a space-oriented art in certain ways, the office spaces,
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, that's another, I keep using the word sort of sentimental, but that's another, right? We get attached to the physical space. We think of the office as being the organization or whatever. But of course, it's not essential.
If you're giving up those spaces and the cost of maintaining that space, you may actually be able to bear more risk.
Yeah, absolutely, right? One more question. Yes.
Hi. This is such great news for the arts, but it's also applicable in so many other sectors, such as education, urban and transportation planning, social sciences. And I'm interested in learning how they could apply what you just presented, in what way, for example. But for a moment, could you just pretend that this is a totally socially conservative audience, and you noticed that there was a Koch brother sitting in the audience? What would you think his reaction would be?
He probably wouldn't, well, he might not like me making fun of Mike Pence. I think he'd recognize the ridiculousness of the Trump slide. Yeah, I mean, I figured I could count on some political leanings in the crowd and maybe pandered a little bit accordingly. I don't know that the political stuff is essential to the message, but you know, I think the Koch brother wouldn't argue with the math on.
Yeah, it's reality.
Right. This is happening. I mean, you know, there's. You would think that like facts are facts and reality is reality, but maybe that's not as true as it used to be. But that particular example, those particular people, I do think are actually smart enough and capable enough to recognize data for what it is, even if some of it has unpalatable implications for them. So I do think that basic story of what's happening with exponential technologies. I mean, look, people have their own cognitive biases, they have their own perspectives that they're coming from. Lots of people do argue with those facts. They say, well, we're gonna run into a wall on this, we're gonna run into a wall on this, or yes, fine, maybe the technology can keep growing, but at some point we're gonna lose our ability as humans to keep up and it'll stop then. The bad news is it's not gonna stop then. But, you know, so people have their counter arguments, and I'm sure that there's elements of a lot of those that are right. But I don't know. Technology is a force of nature. I really believe that. And it's not going to stop because we don't want it to continue. And that actually, you know, scares me, but also makes me hopeful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Really terrific. Thank you so much. Adam Huttler, everybody. Thank you so much, Adam.